Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Saturday, 30th September. It will be cloudy with highs of 9 degrees Celsius or 48 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:51 a.m. and sunset at 6:32 p.m. We are on the 61st day of the Warsaw Uprising and I hear there is a capitulation. Alina, tell us more about that.
Philip, I think this is the first time that you and I are finally able to continue a conversation that we've started. So yes, I am going to start with the capitulation of Żoliborz today. And that all starts with a large, huge, enormous, gigantic attack on the Żoliborz district, the most northern district, from the west, south and north. So more or less, the insurgents have now been completely surrounded, and after 2 days of fighting, the units were in a very small concentrated area defending a matter of a few buildings, and that's all that was left of Żoliborz. It had been utterly destroyed. The fighting was fierce. The insurgents were fighting for literally every square meter, every square foot, every inch of territory, and they suffered a lot of losses on this day, but the insurgents managed to destroy half a dozen tanks, which is incredible in itself considering there's such a small force fighting in such a small area. And finally, at 6 p.m, Żoliborz capitulates. The insurgents lay down their weapons, lay down their troops for several hours, and 1,500 soldiers from that district are captured, including women and children, and 400 wounded. And of course, as we very well know, the Germans are finishing off murdering those who are seriously wounded who've remained in the basements and can't get out or move. Janusz Mulkanowski was a soldier who fought in the Żoliborz district, and he says this is how he remembers. September the 30th was the capitulation of Żoliborz, the laying down of arms. From the morning there was peace. Near the military cemetery in Powązki, there were some warehouses there, old factories. There was a gathering there of all the insurgents, and in the evening they transported us in trucks to Dulag, and we stayed in Dulag for 3 days. Dulag, he's referring to Pruszków, so Dulag 121, that's where he's referring to. So he ends up in Dulag 121 and gets deported to a prisoner of war camp. There are negotiations happening with our lovely provincial accountant, Ere Vondenbach, and there's a ceasefire that's organised for the 1st and 2nd of October, which will allow the civilians to leave the city. So this is the day that Żoliborz capitulates after an incredibly heroic fight, after not being able to break through to the old town to help the insurgents who are fighting in the old town, and after suffering horrific losses during the battles for Gdańsk railway station and suffering more losses on the river Vistula, they still held their own. Now, the other very interesting thing is that the capitulation is not recognised by the Armia Ludowa or the Polish People's Army. So in the evening, a group of 7 insurgents begin a breakthrough towards the river Vistula, and 28 people manage to cross over to Praga on the other side of the river, and unfortunately the rest of them are killed. And as we very well know, the Armia Ludowa, or the Polish People's Army, they were fighting in the old town, and on the 28th, so 28 days into the uprising, before the official order by the Home Army was given to evacuate, they had already evacuated out of the sewers, and then 3 days later, the Home Army gives the order for the rest to evacuate. You all know my feelings on this. You all know that I believe that they were cowards and left and abandoned. And we all know and heard from Roger when he's spoken to us previously that the Polish People's Army are stated in propaganda as the only people that are fighting in the Warsaw Uprising, and that the Home Army is doing nothing. So it's incredible that about 300 people are doing more than over 20,000 others. I just find it mind-blowing to how this propaganda is just ridiculous, and it continues throughout the whole communist period, and the Home Army is never given its recognition, not until the late 80s and early 90s when finally people could start talking about it. But that's a topic for another discussion. This one I could probably rant on for about 25 minutes. I just want to mention one more thing, and that's on this day the President of the Republic of Poland, Władysław Raczkiewicz, changes the status of General Tadeusz Burko Komorowski, who we've spoken about before. He is the head of the Home Army, and now he becomes the Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Armed Forces. So a step up for a very brave man who loved and supported his soldiers, unlike others who have sprouted ridiculous propaganda about him, which Roger will tell us a little bit more about later. So this brings us quite nicely to the subject of women and the decisions and options that women had available to them. Claire, tell us a little bit more about what these women could or could not do.
So more and more sectors of the city are now falling and being forced to capitulate. And Bohr has been negotiating terms and then pulling back when there were massive airdrops from the Americans, then being forced to return to the table and discussing again the terms of capitulation. And now the female fighters, they're being led by Maria Witek. She pulls together the surviving commanders to discuss the options for the women in the city. Zoe is still alive. So is her friend Dr. Zofia Franio, who has been working both as a medical doctor and leading some of the women's sabotage units. Although Dr. Franio's partner, Maria Szuchorowska, has been killed a few nights earlier in Mokotów when her building had collapsed. But Maria Witek brings together the surviving female commanders, including Zoe and Zofia Franio, and summarises their options. Essentially, they have three options. First of all, they could go into German captivity as prisoners of war. Now, this is possible only because Bohr is considering signing that draft decree that Zoe had written to give female fighters legal status as regular soldiers in the Home Army, and because the Home Army is now recognised by the Americans and the British as a regular part of the Polish armed forces. And of course, they're fighting in uniform with armbands displaying who they are. So the battle is out in the open. So they can theoretically benefit from the protections of the Geneva Convention, although there is so little trust, understandably, of the Germans at this point. Zoe said no one knew what the Germans would do to them if they didn't shoot them or hang them. Nevertheless, a number of the women do choose this option. Zoe actually gives up her sheepskin coat to one of her friends going into these camps and hands out her officer cards to some of the other women, hoping that this will get them better conditions in the prisoner of war camps. Their other options are to remove their armbands and either return to civilian life, pretend they're some of the last remaining women civilians in Warsaw, or to remove their armbands and secretly keep fighting, essentially go back to serving in the resistance fight. And Zoe, of course, chooses the last of these. She would never consider becoming a prisoner of war. As she comes out of this briefing meeting, she meets Rum, who's the soldier that I've mentioned a couple of times previously. He's a member of the Silent Unseen who was brought back to serve in the Warsaw Uprising and led his own battalion. Zoe's actually, she's had a lot of admiration for serving in the field. They've become comrades in arms. But she is livid when she hears that Rum has also chosen to surrender as a prisoner of war. He had been sent out to support the courier systems, and she knows as a role that he could continue to play in the resistance. But she dismisses him. She says it's pathetic that he's meekly following his troops to a prisoner of war camp. For her, it's the easiest way out. She says she would never have done it, not even if she'd been ordered. She's pretty tough. Rum noted that the atmosphere at our parting was somewhat cool. Nevertheless, he still recognises, had she have been a man, he'd have accepted that. And he says he is convinced that Zoe continued to work without respite. She blazed the trail. She was a pillar of strength. And she was, above all, one of Poland's most ablest women. Zoe, meanwhile, she's not thinking about Rum at all. She's dismissed him from her mind. She's suffered greater losses already than their friendship. But she feels she needs to continue the fight. She's done her duty, but it's clearly not been enough. They still haven't won Poland's freedom. They are moving forward to accepting defeat and possibly losing their country. And with it, in her mind, her honour as well. And the fight really is her life. She's given one last mission from Bohr Komorowski, the commander of the Home Army, to get out evidence of the fight. Evidence, the narrative of the Warsaw Uprising, because as we've spoken about, there's been all this film footage, all these photographs, and Bohr is keen to make sure that when the Soviets come in, they cannot completely rewrite this history because he will have already sent this information west. So Bohr orders Zoe to get Jan Novak out, the guy who's been running the Lightning radio station and doing all his broadcasts, with microfilm to the west so that the true record remains. So that's her last mission, and she continues the fight.
I really find it interesting, though, that you mentioned that they have more or less three options. But in the first two options that you mentioned, they either return to civilian life or end up going as prisoners of war. They suffer similar fates, more or less. because they either end up in a concentration camp, forced labour, or a prisoner of war camp, none of which is better than the other at this point.
No, I mean, there is limited information for those still in Warsaw about what's happening to the people who go out through Pruszków. At this point, a lot of the fates are still unknown. So they do seem more distinct when they're discussing them as options. But the return to civilian life, I mean, I think they were sceptical. You can see when Zoe says, we don't know what the Germans will do to them. They'll probably shoot them or hang them. She's pretty sceptical about it. But they're not rich in options. But she herself obviously keeps going. And the only protection she has is that Borkomrowski, the commander, has given her a little slip of white silk, which she sews inside the lining of her clothes. And on that is typed orders that everyone, I mean, this is obviously for the Poles, everyone who meets her must help her complete her mission. But that's all she's got. And she goes on to continue serving.
Right, Roger, tell us what's going on with the Soviets, because we've not heard much from you this episode. So tell us more.
Yeah, there's an interesting element of the Moscow narrative of the Warsaw Rising, which I know I've spoken about before, but obviously with the Rising itself approaching its end, it becomes all the more critical for Moscow to control that narrative, as we just heard from Claire. This becomes, to some extent, a war of narratives that the Home Army and their, as representatives of the government in exile in London, are trying to control the narrative on their side, and the Soviets are doing the same. Quite an important moment in that wider propaganda battle from chap I'm sure we've mentioned before, Edward Ossowski-Morawski, who is the chairman of the Polish Committee of National Liberation, the Moscow Poles, we can call them. This is the sort of the government in waiting under Soviet auspices that was formed in Lublin in eastern Poland, ready to step in once Poland had been, in inverted commas, liberated from the Germans. And he's making it very plain in this press conference on 30th September. The Home Army itself, and by extension the government in exile, is viewed. He actually describes Borkomrowski as a war criminal, which is a sort of step up in the rhetoric. Prior to that, there was talked about how he was reckless and how he hadn't supposedly hadn't consulted with Moscow or with the Western allies in launching this rising in Warsaw. Now he's being described openly as a war criminal, and they're saying that he's more hated among the Poles than Sosnkowski is because of that. As they see it, as they try and portray it, that sort of personal responsibility for the Warsaw Rising. So this is kind of a step change in the sort of vehemence of that rhetoric, and it really presages a lot of what we know comes afterwards with the trial of the 16 members of the senior members of the Home Army who are spirited away to Moscow and put on trial. This is the sort of the final coup de grace inflicted on the leadership of the Home Army. But that's sort of set up by this sort of inflammatory and really sort of vehement rhetoric that you're seeing from representatives of the Moscow Poles.
Of course, that's not Borkomrowski's fate, though. I mean, he leads his men into the prisoner of war camps and therefore has some protections.
Indeed, and of course ends his days in comparative safety in London. So yes, he does escape that fate. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us for day 61. We only have 2 days left and a context episode left before we finish the podcast. But I just got a message from Todd on Twitter asking me what the song is at the end. Now, very quickly, I'll let you all know the first song that's played for this podcast is the national anthem, the Polish national anthem. And the second song is a song by Józef Szczepański. We talked about him, the poet, the guy who wrote my favourite song, Pałacyk Michla. This song in Polish is called Chłopcy silni jak stal, but in English it's called Boys as Tough as Steel, and you'll be able to find the English version on YouTube. So just to reiterate that, it's Boys as Tough as Steel, or for the people that want to give it a go in Polish, Chłopcy silni jak stal. Amazing, thank you so much, and we will see you all tomorrow for day 62.